So today's video is going to be on plant propagation, and propagation is the science and art of reproducing plants. There's two ways that you can reproduce a plant. The first one is sexually, which is plants that need a male and a female part to produce a new seed. And there are two different kinds of propagation when it comes to sexual propagation. And the first one is direct seeding, which is planting the seed where you want the plant to mature when it gets to the end of its life cycle. And a good example of that is with corn. So when you're planting corn, you plant it right into the field and then it's mature and ready to harvest in the same spot. Indirect seeding is when you would take like a flat and you would plant a bunch of seeds in the flat, and then once they mature to a certain age, you would then take them and transplant them in a different area or a different pot. And the second type of propagation is asexual, which is also known as vegetative propagation. A good example of that is this Monstera plant. I will show an example of how to do that after this. So one of the vocab words that I want you guys to know is node. And a node is a section of the plant where it is possible to break and form roots. So if you can see this plant right here, at the bottom there is a node, and then there's another node where the roots are forming from. And it's kind of like this seam. If you can see, there's a seam. And there's also an air root, which you'll see, I'll show you in the Monstera plant. And ways that plants can reproduce naturally are with adventitious roots that form above the ground and help the plant branch out, which are very common in strawberries, and rhizotomous roots that form below the ground, and those are very common in weeds. So if you're pulling a weed and it just keeps going and going and going and then it gets to another plant, that is rhizotomous. So this plant is called a Monstera plant, and the easiest way to propagate this plant is to locate an aerial root, which is what this is right here. And what you do is you grab this section and then cut 1 inch below the root. And after that, so generally you would use a pruning shear or a gardening knife, but all I have on me are these tin snips, so I will be using these. But you grab this section, go about 1 inch below, and then try to get a clean cut, and then what you have is the plant section with the root. So now you have your cutting, and any container will do. You just grab a container that's large enough to fit your cutting and the root without damaging the root. And if it doesn't fit all the way in without breaking the root, just try and bend it. And then place it in so that it sits in a comfortable position. Or you're gonna wanna put water into it up to about 1 inch above the root. So this is a very good way to reproduce a Monstera plant asexually. And once this has grown subroots, then in about 6 weeks you can transplant it to a pot. The soil that you're going to want to use is a mix of cactus soil, potting soil, and then you can also use peat moss and orchid bark. You want to make sure that you are monitoring the plant throughout the 6 weeks and making sure that the water level stays where it is, because if it gets too low and the roots aren't getting enough water, then the plant will start to wilt and it will eventually die. So make sure that you're keeping the water levels up and you're watching the plant. As it's growing roots, you're going to want to place this bucket in the same area that you have the main plant so that it can get the same light that the main plant is getting. For Monstera plants, they like indirect lighting, so a south-facing window is really good. You don't want the plant to be getting too much light. If it gets some direct light in the day, like in the afternoon, that's okay. But you want to make sure that both of these plants are put in the same spot. This is a pothos plant, and with pothos plants, it's easiest to propagate when you can find a node, and a node would be a section like this where you can see that it obviously has a seam. And a few weeks ago, when we planted this originally, I took a couple cuttings from this plant and I put them in water. And when you have them in water for a few weeks, they will start to grow roots. So as you can see, this one doesn't have leaves yet, but it started to grow roots down here in this node, and that's where it was broken off at. So these don't need a lot of light, but once it gets to this stage and you can see that it has pretty sufficient root growth, you can replant it in a pot. Now, this isn't anything special with this water, it's really just a cup with water from the faucet in it. But pothos is a really great example of asexual reproduction because it's very easy to just take off a piece, put it in water, and then replant it in a few weeks. Alright, pothos likes really indirect lighting, so this is where I have mine. And it's in a corner next to a door and a window, so it doesn't get any direct sunlight, it just gets the brightness that's in the room. So this is an area where it's really gonna thrive. Where I was working this summer, it was in the basement and there were no windows, and it survived just off of LED lights. So they really don't need a lot. This plant is very hard to kill.